Hello! Welcome back to another episode of the Delicious Legacy podcast. My name is Thomas Dinas, and on each episode I'm going to take you to a different ancient gastronomic adventure. Strap in while we're traveling back in time and enjoy our delicious adventures. Another archaeogastronomical adventure begins this week, and today we're talking about the history of pickles. And we're not going to just say pickled vegetables, of course, but all sorts of pickles. The ancients literally pickled everything. And yes, today's episode will be a lot of fun, so strap in and enjoy. The unmistakable pungent smell of vinegar pierces through my nostrils, even as I talk now. I'm not entirely sure if I will ever get used to it. To the smell, of course. Especially when cooking with vinegar, as we do with pickles. I can hardly believe it will transform everyday vegetables to something delicious. Something more important than the sum of its parts. And certainly, that something will actually make me change my mind about vinegar. I like vinegar, don't get me wrong. I do like it. I use it in salads and marinades all the time, of course. But yeah, unlike my father, of course, who never liked vinegar in foods. Such a strange man sometimes. Well, all the times, actually. Anyway, I digress. Pickles are, of course, popular and important. Perhaps a lot more important in the past, as this can be attested in the use of the word on everyday conversation and expressions through the ages. For many thousands of years, pickles were extremely important due to the fact that food could be made to last. From the summers of abundance, food could actually be preserved and let humans get by in the lean seasons. The glut of vegetables, fish and meat could be preserved and provide significant calorific content for the ancient families the world over. At the same time, preserving food meant that ancient people could transport it over vast distances when traveling or when exchanging goods with other peoples and nations. No one knows really who invented and how the first pickles discovered, of course, but some of the most ancient civilizations have invented in parallel pickling techniques in different ways, as we shall see. The Chinese pickled with salt, the Mesopotamians with vinegar. The techniques that they mastered over millennia are in use with us still today. In China, which is considered the birthplace of fermented salt pickles, a poem was written sometime in the 11th century BCE, describing pickling gourds. The Koreans took salt-fermented Chinese cabbage and added chilies to create their own fiery kimchi. The Japanese embraced the methods from both and added more of their own techniques, and today they boast at least 7 principal pickling techniques. In Iraq, a great variety of pickles known as tursi is prepared with vinegar. The vegetables are first soaked in brine, which crisps and firms them and allows limited fermentation, and then covered with cold vinegar that has been pre-boiled with herbs and spices. In the English vocabulary, the word pickle first appears around 1400 and is derived from the Dutch pekkel. At first, it referred to a spicy sauce served with meat, but soon came to mean brine or vinegar in which food was preserved. 17th century marked the high point of vinegar pickles in Britain. Experimentation and innovation, fired by developments at home and abroad, alongside the expansion of the kitchen garden, gave an abundance of produce to preserve, while trade with India brought exotic pickles to the table. Of course, we cannot talk about pickles without talking about vinegar, without talking about alcohol, because obviously the ancients found out that by fermenting grains and fermenting fruit juices, they could make alcohol, and then from alcohol, obviously, you can have vinegar, and from vinegar, you can preserve foods. The ancient Babylonians and Egyptians, the world's first beer brewers, took note of the grain's natural ability to unravel starch into sugar and harnessed it to create the process of malting. Maltsters germinate grain by exposing it to moisture, then stop its life cycle short by roasting and drying the grain. From there, They mix the malt with hot water, after which yeast can ferment the now unlocked sugars into alcohols. And voila, we have beer or mash for whiskey. Fermentation knows no borders. It's as much a part of a cooking tradition in Denmark as it's in Italy, Japan or China. Without fermentation, there is no kimchi, no sourdough bread, no parmigiano, no wine or beer, no pickles, no soy sauce. And fermentation is responsible for improving everything. Lacto-fermented pickles, where bacteria consume sugar and generate lactic acid, souring the vegetables in the process, and the brine, in which they sit, simultaneously preserving them and rendering them more delicious. The word fermentation comes from the Latin word fervere, meaning to boil. The ancient Romans, upon seeing vats of grape juice spontaneously bubble and transform into wine, described the process using the closest analogue they could think of. And while those bubbling vats of grapes had nothing to do with boiling, they were true ferments in the modern scientific sense, as yeast-produced enzymes transform the sugars in the grapes into alcohol. From a taste perspective, the processes at work in fermentation that matter to us are those that break down large chains of molecules into their constituent parts. Starches in foods like rice, barley, peas, and bread are actually long chains of linked molecules of glucose, a simple sugar. Proteins, which can be found in soybeans and meats, are in similar fashion lengthy, winding chains of amino acids. One of those amino acids, glutamic acid, registers on our taste receptors as umami, the elusive, crave-inducing quality that connects foods such as mushrooms, tomatoes, cheese, meat, and soy sauce. So the fact that starch molecules are too big to be registered by our body as sweet or umami-rich, when they break down to simple sugars and free amino acids through fermentation, then become obviously delicious. Our affection for the tastes those microbes produce have allowed them to evolve and stay in our company. We have been fermenting for so long that we might consider these microorganisms domesticated, just like our household cats and dogs. Sure, tricky to understand when they're hungry, and they need a bit more work to keep happy, but this is the job of the fermenter. In fact, some people, certain philosophers, might say that humans were domesticated by these bacteria, enzymes, and fungi in order for them to thrive. There's definitely an element of codependence and cooperation here. These organisms occupy environments the world over, just like humans. They are present in the milk of mammals, meaning you and I have been involved in an intractable relationship with these bacteria since the first moments of our lives. Lactobacillales are present on the skins and leaves of just about any vegetable or fruit you would ever want to ferment. The first mention of koji in print can be found in the Rites of Zhu, a Chinese governmental text from around 300 BCE, which referred to the mold as chu, spelled Q-U. Over the next few centuries, records indicate that chu became a major commodity in China. Instructions for the brewing of grain-based wines and bean pastes appear in official Chinese texts some 300 years later, and a steady proliferation of knowledge followed. By the 8th century CE, koji had reached Japan. In Greek language, modern Greek that is, we use the word tursi, which comes from the Turkish word tursu. And certainly I think the Turks have taken the lead and dethroned the Greeks and the Romans, and they're renowned for the love of pickles, a lot more than many others. I believe the Turkish people are known all over Europe for the love of pickles. You don't have to go far. In every Middle Eastern and Turkish supermarket in UK, you can find a dizzying and dazzling array of pickles on offer, and all from Turkey. The humble olive is certainly the most famous of all pickles. Early Mediterranean civilizations discovered that olives which produce the magical liquid gold can also be used as food. They can be debittered by soaking them in repeated changes of water, a rather long process, sometimes taking many months and requiring the use also of a brine solution, which actually even improved their taste by slightly fermenting them. Here is fermentation again, always playing its magical transformative role. I love it. Olives were found in the shipwreck dated back to 600 BCE of a possible Etruscan origin. It seems all over the Mediterranean people were eating olives. The Etruscan civilization thrived in central North Italy, and they were the closest neighbors and rivals of Romans, and Rome absorbed them into their sphere of influence around 300, 200 BCE. Of course, archaeologists also excavated Pompeii and found olives there too, in the lava-buried stores of the ancient city. From Turkey to Spain, these little bitter bombs are cultivated and cured in a huge variety of ways and with a huge variety of ingredients. All olives are green at first, turning black as they ripen. In ancient Greece, special olive varieties were harvested green with the express purpose of pickling. Romans, of course, being, as usual, a lot more impatient and of a practical nature compared to the philosophical Greeks, came up with a technique that improved the fermenting and also reduced the time needed considerably. Supplementing the brine with lye from wood ashes, which is sodium hydroxide, cut the time required to produce edible olives from months to mere hours. Dry or Greek-style curing is a method in which plump black olives are layered in barrels with dry rock salt. No liquid is added. The salt breaks down the bitterness and leaches it out. The olives are stirred daily, and a purplish liquid leached from them is drained from the bottom of the barrels. After 4 to 6 weeks, the olives are rinsed to remove the salt and glycoside and lightly coated in oil. They are wrinkled and purple in color, and while these qualities might seem a bit odd at first, the flavor is excellent and the nutritional value is excellent too. Cato, the ancient Roman writer, in his Liber de Agricultura, notes that the varieties Orchite and Posea are excellent when preserved green in brine. He offers the recipe below for pickling in vinegar and oil, which is typical of many. How green olives are conserved. Before they turn black, are to be broken and put into water. The water is to be changed frequently. When they have soaked sufficiently, they are drained, put into vinegar and oil is added. Half a pound of salt to 1 peck of olives. Fennel and lentisk put up separately in vinegar. When you decide to mix them, use quickly. Pack in preserving jars. When you wish to use, take with dry hands. The 2nd century physician Galen, that we have heard of in previous episodes, thought olives to be beneficial to health. In his treatise, De Alimentorum Facultatibus, on the properties of foodstuffs, he observed that those stored in salt brine and eaten with fish sauce before a meal purged the intestine, strengthened the stomachos, and stimulated the appetite. Olives pickled in vinegar were even better. A handbook of Greek humoral dietary theory, De Alimentis, concurred. The green ones that are conserved as colimbades are good to eat owing to their astringency. They arouse the appetite. Those covered in vinegar are especially suited as food. The procedure of pickling olives, described above by Cato, other procedures from Columella and other writers, more than 2,000 years ago, is still practiced today, and which, to my mind, is incredible. Overall, ancient Romans loved their pickles, and Pliny listed many different varieties of pickles and their provinces, providing a remarkable catalogue of flavors. Onions, for example, were pickled in honey and vinegar, a recipe of a kind still found in cookery books. One of its virtues was to stimulate thirst, so that Romans ate it throughout the meal. Later, the Franks adopted the same custom and are said to have eaten onions as avidly as they've drained the tankards of beer. Gherkins, first mentioned as late as 1549, the first written mention of gherkins actually, when it occurs in the work of Robert Estienne. Although cucumbers and gherkins, as obviously we know that a small variety of rough-skinned cucumber, have been very popular in Europe in classical times. Gherkins picked before they ripen have been eaten in India for more than 30 centuries, with salt or lemon juice. We in Europe use vinegar instead. Few of us realize how exotic the gherkin once was. Gherkins came to Europe during the Renaissance. The English gherkin, like the related German Gurke, for cucumber and gherkins alike, comes ultimately from the Greek word agurion. The ancient Mesopotamians had a taste for pickles. You remember, Mesopotamia is considered the cradle of civilization, and we have written records of recipes and stuff from about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. The ancient Mesopotamian people had a taste for pickles. Among the world's earliest recorded recipes inscribed on clay tablets are several which call for siku, a sauce prepared from pickled fish or locusts. The Mesopotamians used this piquant brine to flavor the dishes. They made vinegar from barley or grapes, and they served a variety of pickles with their meals. In the ancient city of Mari, the grand royal palace of Zimri Lim retained a pantry maid, whose special duties included making pickles and fruit conserves for the king's pleasure. It is likely she pickled the vegetables as cooks in the region do now, salting or soaking them in brine before immersing them in vinegar. Were we able to step back in time, we would find the maid in the royal pantry preparing turnips, snake melons, leeks, onions, radishes, palm hearts, capers, and olives. At certain times of the year, reed cages rustling with migratory locusts or grasshoppers would be delivered to the palace to meet their demise. They were packed live into earthenware jars and drowned in brine. Freshly picked locusts were a tasty and popular snack. The above practice was taken up by the Persians, the next superpower in the region, an empire in the Near and Central Middle East, which came to their height at around 500 BCE. Through its various guises, from the Seleucid Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Sassanids, and so on, it continued until the Arab conquest, when they picked the techniques for pickling, and much later the Ottomans too, and thanks to them, a long-lasting tradition of pickling with a familiar acidic kick was established in the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. In modern Iran and Iraq, the Persians and Arabs ruled supreme and established some of the richest and most influential learning centers of the medieval world. The city of Baghdad was the epicenter, the culinary capital of epic proportions, a shining light in the so-called Dark Ages, which we know they weren't Dark Ages, of course. The sophistication of the Persians' court's eating habits and cuisine, augmented with the Arab thriftiness, gave rise to something more complex and richer than its constituent parts, a culinary tradition in which the sour flavors of fermented foods in vinegar, lemon or grape juice were highly prized. Tastes that were amply sated by pickles. The Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century ate pickles and relishes along with sour and salty condiments or dips, known as kamak, that were an essential part of daily meals. They were eaten with bread as appetizers, or taken through the meal to pep up the appetite and aid digestion. The Abbasid prince Ibn al-Mutaz was moved enough to write a poem extolling their splendor. Of course, we are lucky enough to know how these relishes and pickles were prepared. The recipes have come down through two remarkable cookbooks. Ibn Sayyar al-Waraq's Book of Recipes records the dishes of kings and caliphs, lords and leaders from the 8th century to the 10th century. A later work of the same title, penned by the 13th century scribe known as al-Baghdadi, unashamedly records for posterity his personal favorites. Here we discover a pickled shrimp relish prepared with apples and honey wine that doubles as an aphrodisiac, and a chutney called makra, prepared from chopped turnip, quince, Levantine apple and citron, soured with a starter of bread dough to encourage fermentation, a technique still used today in northern Iraq to pickle turnips. We also learn how to pickle capers, olives and locusts. So here is a recipe for pickled locusts for your pleasure. Use locusts that have been just caught. Discard the dead ones and put the live ones in brine. When they all suffocate and die, strain them and keep the drain liquid. Grind as much as needed of coriander seeds, fennel seeds and dried leaves of asafoetida. In a big, white jar, put layers of drained locusts, sprinkle them with prepared spice mix and give them a generous sprinkle of salt. Repeat the layers. Allow the sediments of the drained brine in which the locusts suffocated to settle down. Slowly pour enough of the clean brine over. Completely seal the jar with mud. No air should be allowed to get into the jar, as this will cause the pickled locusts to go bad. Now be patient and wait for them until they mature and become delicious and eat them. Pickled locusts were a favorite of the ancient Mesopotamians, as we've seen earlier. That recipe for them, which appears thousands of years later in the medieval manuscripts from Baghdad, should be surprising, I guess, but it's not. There's a remarkable similarity between the recipes inscribed on 3 cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia written around 1700 BCE and those on Al-Waraq's cookbook almost 3,000 years later. If, as it seems, the food customs of the Mesopotamians, including the combination of ingredients and spices and the liking of vinegar, were acquired by the Persians, then the Persians in turn contributed with their tastes and innovations, which in turn embraced and elaborated upon by the Arabs. But this culinary time and space travel past the parcel game did not stop there. The lineage of many pickles enjoyed across North Africa and the Middle East and Spain, as well as Latin America, can be traced back to these early recipes. A history of pickles is the history of the world. Pickles is a relish, a condiment, preservation technique to store food pre-fridge for millennia. A gift from the gods, surely. One can pickle fish, pickle meat, such as birds and pork especially, pickle cheese, which the most famous pickle cheese of course is feta, surely. Going back to our lovely scribe and foodie al-Baghdadi, who devotes a whole chapter to pickles, relishes and condiments, he says vinegar pickles were made in great variety, using a profusion of fresh produce supplied from Baghdad's fertile hinterland. He prepared sweet pickled turnips from chopped pieces of the root, salted, spiced and herbed, and immersed in vinegar, sweetened with honey and colored with saffron. For mint pickle, he takes dried leaves and sprinkles them with aromatic herbs, bottling them with celery leaves and quarters of peeled garlic in good vinegar, golden with saffron. He also offers the following recipe for aubergine pickle, which we can still find prepared this way across the Middle East today, 800 years later. Take medium aubergines and cut off half the stems and leaves. Then half boil them in water and salt. Take them up and dry them off. Then quarter them lengthwise and stuff them with fresh celery leaves, a few bunches of mint and peeled cloves of garlic, and pack them one on another in a glass jug. Sprinkle a little of the herbs and finely ground mixed spices on them. Cover them with good vinegar and leave them until they're thoroughly mature and use them. Fish, meat and poultry were regularly pickled in vinegar for keeping. A particular dish, sekbaj, best described as meat set in vinegar aspic, is of great significance to our pickle story. Sekbaj was a favorite dish of both the Sasanian Persian court and the Arabs. Its name is derived from sik, the Persian for vinegar, and baj, meaning stew. It was prepared by cooking pieces of fatty meat in water with herbs, spices, and assorted vegetables, to which wine vinegar and honey or date molasses was added, each to balance the other. The stew was finished with almonds, saffron, and dried fruits, and once it had cooled, it was sprinkled with rose water. This dish was to inspire pickled foods of a different form in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. The dishes and relishes of the medieval cookbooks of Baghdad continue to resonate in the variety of pickles. Torsi, derived from the tors, meaning sour in Persian, and from which the Turks get the tursu and the Greek tursi, which are enjoyed across North Africa and the Middle East. The Arabs swept into the Iberian Peninsula from the early 8th century CE and ushered an era of unprecedented cultural, artistic, scientific and gastronomic growth that introduced to the backward locals to exotic ingredients and brand new exciting culinary customs. Dishes brought to Moorish Spain from the Eastern Islamic world, among them pickles and condiments and the steamed sikbaj mentioned earlier. Today's berenjenas de Almagro from La Mancha is a direct legacy of the Arabs, and this is a dish of pickled aubergines prepared in Ciudad Real region of central Spain. This Almagro variety is unique to the area and are pickled when they're still small and green. Dishes prepared escabeche style, soused in vinegar, are common across Spain and Portugal, and they are another pickling legacy from the Arabs. Etymologically, the name is thought to be derived from the royal court dish we mentioned earlier, sikbaj, but don't quote me on that, that's what I've read. The common Arab practice of cooking and pickling fish, or any variety of fish, fowl and meat, spread to the Iberian Peninsula, proving very popular for preserving game, particularly partridge, quail, pigeon, rabbit, oily fish such as sardines, mackerel, shad and tuna, and in Portugal, small eels. In an early 14th century Catalan treatise, the Libre de Sente Sovi includes a recipe for escabeig or esquabe, all comprising fried fish, over which is poured a hot vinegar sauce thickened in various ways. Other medieval cookery manuscripts show this pickling technique traveled to France and Italy, and escabeche and scapeche both refer to fried fish in a vinegar-based marinade, which is served cold, typically as an appetizer. Once in the pickling liquor and refrigerated, the fish will keep for a few weeks. The infamous conquistadores took the pickling technique of escabeche to Central and South America in the 16th century. The method was not only used for game and fish, as in Spain, but it was adopted and adapted to pickle vegetables using vinegar fermented from sugarcane. In South America, the meat of capybara, reputed to be the world's largest rodent, is prepared escabeche. A more conventional fish escabeche originates from the thriving colonial port of Veracruz, the second Spanish settlement in Latin America. And Latin American created its own fresh pickled fish dish, ceviche, which has been exported the world over. The dish, as you may know, is a specialty of Peru, from where it's believed to originate. Ceviche is prepared from raw fillets of fish, octopus, squid or shrimps, or prawns, marinated in lemon, lime or bitter orange juice. The acidity of the citrus juices modifies the proteins of the fish, acting in a similar way to heat. Together with the acidic element, sliced onions, chilies and salt, they're combined and is served at room temperature. In Philippines, another Spanish colonial venture, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, a fresh fish pickle dish, known as kinilaw, using vinegar rather than citrus juice, has been prepared in the archipelago for at least 1,000 years. Whatever the origins of ceviche, definitely owes a lot to the Iberian trade routes between the ports of the New World and the Far East Asiatic islands. The medieval cookbook of Richard II, the Forme of Cury, provides the earliest English recipe for chutney. It appears under the unpromising title of compost. To prepare the chutney, the king's master cooks took white turnips, parsnips, radishes and pears, cut them into chunks and boiled them. Once cold, they added salt, vinegar, spices and saffron and let the mixture sit overnight. The following day, they stirred in Greek wine and honey, Lombardy mustard, raisins, currants, walnuts, sweet spices and seeds of anise and fennel. This so-called compost was stored in an earthenware pot and used as required. This elaborate concoction can be traced back to ancient Rome and the simple recipe given by Apicius for turnips preserved in honey and vinegar, which we mentioned earlier. In Asia, myriad pickles are produced without the resource to brine or vinegar. In China and Japan, salty fermented foods provide the pickling medium. The Chinese favor soybean paste and wine lees. The Japanese, in addition, use soy sauce, koji, and cooked rice and rice mold. All this starts, as we said earlier, aged fermentation. the lactic acid bacteria converted to lactic acid, giving the pickled food a high acidity, which ensures it keeps well for a long time. Another ancient Chinese manuscript, the Zhu Li, so the rights of the Zhu, which details the posts and duties of government officials in the Zhou dynasty. We're talking about 1046 to 256 BCE. So this document illustrates the range of pickled foods prepared at this time, referred to as qi or zhu. According to the Zhu Li, the superintendent of fermented victuals was responsible for pickling, which now utilized vinegar as well as salt. To take care of the domestic needs of the royal household, the superintendent prepared 60 jars for storing fermented condiments and preserves. He fills them with 5 types of finely sliced pickled meat or vegetables, 7 kinds of boneless paste, 7 varieties of coarsely cut pickled vegetables, and 3 kinds of meat paste still mixed with bone. The pastes which accompanied the pickles were prepared from a variety of finely sliced meats, including snails, frogs, rabbit, and deer. These were mixed with salt, mulled ferment, and good wine, and left for 100 days. Pickled turnip was paired with venison paste, water mallow with a paste of raw back deer, and cattail root with a paste made from elafure, Chinese deer. Pickles were an integral part of meals in the royal palace, and always available for use in the rituals or entertainments. At the same time, simple pickles were an essential food for the masses. Records from the building of the Great Wall of China under the first emperor Qin Shi Huang in the 3rd century BCE indicate that conscripted peasants, counted in their tens of thousands, were given rations of fermented vegetables in return for their labors. The most famous queen of ancient Egypt, Cleopatra, is supposed to have attributed her beauty into a diet of pickles. Yet, the ancient Egyptians left little evidence of the variety of foods they preserved in brine or vinegar. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the Babylonians and Egyptians pickled birds and fish using salty seawater, a reference to evaporating seawater in pans to produce a strong brine. Of course, we have paintings at tombs from the necropolis of Thebes, where we have geese or ducks being plucked and eviscerated before being placed in earthenware vessels. And similar scenes appear in other tomb paintings, and an amphora containing birds preserved with salt was found at the tomb of Ka. It seems that pickled birds were consumed without further preparation. The Greek historian Herodotus, in his book Histories, writes quails also, and ducks and small birds, they eat uncooked, merely salting them first. The ancient Romans left us in no doubt as to their enthusiasm for pickles. There was little that didn't find its way to brine or vinegar. Columella, writing in the 1st century CE, advises his fellow citizens, "Now is the time, if pickles chip you sick, to plant the caper and hearse and la campane, and threatening fennel, creeping roots of mint, and fragrant flowers of dill as paste now, and rue, which the Palladian berry's taste improves, and mustard, which will make him weep, whoever provokes it. Now the roots are set, of Alexander's dark, the weepy onion." And to add to Columella's planting list, turnips, swedes, cardoons, cabbage, chicory, lettuce, samphire, and asparagus. They were all pickled. Butcher's broom, catmint, horseradish, rue, parsley, thyme, savory, and marjoram. Vine leaves and shoots, plums, sorbs, cornel berries, and nuts. And you have a sense of the variety of produce to be found in a pickle store. In his book, in Columella's treatise on agriculture, volume 3, book 12, he observes that the use of vinegar and hard brine is very necessary, they say, for the making of preserves. To prepare hard brine, Columella takes a wide-mouthed amphora, places it out in the sun, and fills it with rain or spring water, into which he suspends a basket of salt. The basket is shaken and the salt topped up from time to time until it ceases to dissolve, an indication that the solution is saturated. The brine was deemed to be of sufficient strength when a piece of fresh cheese, small dried fish, or a hen's egg floated, a test which we can still employ today, or it's been still employed today to test the brine. Vinegar was prepared from flat wine and a concoction of other ingredients, including yeast, dried figs, salt, honey, fresh mint, toasted barley and walnuts, to name but a few. All this encouraged fermentation and add flavor. Fresh, unfermented grape juice, known as must, was another popular pickling medium. Must combined with vinegar or brine was used for plums, the cherry berries, or for pickling roots and for fermenting olives. Cardoons were given special treatment, preserved in vinegar and honey. So, as Pliny the Elder notes, there may be no day without thistles for dinner. Turnips were another popular pickle. Columella pickles turnips in vinegar and mustard. The famous or infamous gourmand Apicius, which we have seen earlier on the podcast, indulges his countryman's penchant for combining sweet and sour. In one recipe, he pickles turnips with myrtle berries, vinegar and honey. In another, he mixes mustard with honey, vinegar and salt. And one very important pickle, as we known and seen a few times, that the Greeks and the Romans loved, was garum, the fermented fish sauce. Apicius has an appetizing pickled fish dish, which is titled To Preserve Fried Fish, and the instructions are to the point. The moment the fish is fried, take them out of the pan and pour hot vinegar over them. Fish pickled in vinegar is still prepared in Italy today. It's prepared in Greece this way, and we've seen throughout the medieval times, we've seen similar dishes throughout Spain and France. The Italian pilgrim Pietro Cassola visited Crete at the end of the 15th century, and he said, "They make a great many cheeses. It is a pity they are all so salty. I saw great warehouses full of them, some in which the brine, or salmoria, as we would say, was 2 feet deep, and the large cheeses were floating in. Those in charge told me that these cheeses could not be preserved in any other way, being so rich." So this seems to be a mention of feta cheese then. At the height of the Ottoman Empire, which dominated the southern Europe and Anatolia for centuries, the Turkish sultans, they drew in culinary practices from across the empire, and particularly from the Arab and Persian cuisine. And of course, they had lots and lots of pickles. A selection of pickles appeared at every meal, and the kitchen accounts reveal that they were consumed in great quantities. In 1620, more than 11,000 cabbages were purchased for pickling. Aside from cabbages, the cooks pickled turnips, artichokes, aubergines, cucumbers and gourds, and numerous fruits, including lemons, bitter oranges, pomegranates, and all these using the finest yellow vinegar of the Bursa province. So the Ottomans and the cuisine of the Ottomans was inspired by the writings of al-Baghdadi, the 13th century scribe we've seen earlier on. His cookbook was the favorite Arabic cookbook of the Ottomans, and the original manuscript is still held in Istanbul in the Topkapi Palace. And as we've seen earlier, the dietary qualities of foods, which were based on the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, influenced also the Ottomans, and they paid great attention to this. So they liked pickles, and particularly pickled capers, onions and garlic, pickled radish with vinegar, and beetroot pickle with mustard. These were all regarded as gentle nutrients, which aided digestion. Their consumption was recommended to counter the effects of coarse, indigestible foods, of which it seems there were many. Of course, a famous or infamous pickle is herrings. A 14th century Dutchman, William Pickles, is credited with the invention of pickled herrings. Preserving this oily fish in brine transformed the herring's culinary and commercial potential. The abundant herring became known as the silver of the sea, and its trade helped shape the balance of economic powers in Europe. The Dutch method was revolutionary. Pickling the perishable herrings gutted and flat in salt water rather than piled in irregular salted heaps, excluded air, which meant they kept well. This advance was enhanced by processing the herrings while they were still at their freshest. At the instant the nets were landed, that is, out at sea rather than back in the harbour. So the Dutch pickled herrings acquired a reputation for quality no other nation could match, and the Dutch invested heavily in this new venture. By 1410, they had built wide-bodied, multi-decked ships, herring buses, for the express purpose of catching and salting herrings far from the Dutch ports. These distinctive three-masted ships were the forerunners of the modern factory ships. During the herring season, between July and December, they were able to stay at sea for weeks at a time, maximizing their catch and cutting costs. So fleets of Dutch buses operated off England and Scotland in sight of the shore, outnumbering and outfishing the small local herring boats. And the pickling process was highly regulated by the Dutch government to guarantee quality. The fish were gutted immediately after they were taken from the nets, grated and packed tightly head to tail in salted layers in wooden barrels. Each barrel was topped up with seawater, sealed and dated. Correctly labelled, the brined herrings stayed in good condition for up to a year. In this pickled form, Dutch herrings were traded in every major European market. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch posted a fleet of 2,000 buses and controlled Europe's herring trade. They forced the Flemish out of business, conquered the German and Baltic markets, and supplied more than half of the pickled herrings sent to London. Dutch cured herrings commanded more than twice the price of those pickled in Yarmouth, Scarborough or Bridlington. Pickled herrings were the staple food of rich and poor alike. They were served straight from the brine or in well-to-do homes combined with other ingredients. The English chopped them small and along with oil added finely chopped onion, lemon and apples. At some point in time, it became commonplace to put the brined herrings in vinegar solution with various flavorings, including peppercorns, mace, bay leaves, onion, mustard seeds, dill, and in the case of sweet pickled herrings, sugar. Sweden's popular dill seal, pieces of herring fillet bottled in vinegar with sugar and dill, continues this tradition. Alas, from the 18th century onwards, the herring industry faltered, ending 400 years of the Dutch domination, yet the pickled herring remained an essential food of the poor, peasant and labouring classes across Eastern Europe until well into the 20th century. Of course, we cannot talk about pickles and the history of pickles and not mention sauerkraut, which is very, 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 very popular nowadays, of course, and it's been for some centuries. But in the history of pickles, in the long history of pickles, sauerkraut is, or at least as we make it today, is a relatively newcomer, no more than 400 years old. The distinguishing feature of sauerkraut is that it's dry salted. Other cabbage pickles that we've seen, or we know of, and those perfected by the Chinese a few thousand years ago, they are prepared wet by adding brine to the cabbage. For sauerkraut, dry salt is sprinkled into the shredded cabbage, weighted down. Within a short amount of time, the cabbage gives up sufficient moisture to create its own brine and fermentation begins. This innovation, which Europe can claim as its own, was arrived at by degrees. The Romans pickled the cabbage in brine and vinegar. In the Middle Ages, cabbage was cut into pieces, packed into crocks and covered with verjuice, sour wine or vinegar, to which great quantities of salt were added. Contemporary accounts describe how the French prepared cabbages this way. The highly acidic and salty liquids preserved the vegetables, but had its limitations. Significant quantities of vinegar or verjuice were required for pickling, while the sourness and saltiness of the pickled cabbage meant it required soaking in plain water before use. So obviously the German word sauerkraut literally means sour cabbage, and may be the indicative of the predominant tastes of these early cabbage pickles. But clever, resourceful people at some point thought that maybe we should drop the sour liquids and then just place it in brine. And this development reduced the sourness of the pickle liquor and facilitated the lactofermentation, which improved the cabbage's flavour. One of the earliest accounts of preserving cabbage in brine provided in 1607 by Le Trésor de Santi, which describes how Germans prepared the cabbage for winter use. These cabbages were shredded and placed in layers with salt, juniper berries, spices, barberries, and pepper. Each layer was pressed down firmly and brine added. By the time Hannah Glass came to include a recipe for sauerkraut in her 1758 edition of The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, the method of dry salting was well established. She notes, "It is a dish much made use of amongst the Germans, and in the north countries where the frost kills all the cabbages. The hard white cabbages were pickled whole, with a large handful of salt to every 4 or 5 heads, and powdered caraway seeds to give a fine flavor. Once salted, the cabbages were weighted down, covered closely, and left to stand for a month before using." Captain Cook, the English explorer, widely credited with winning the battle against scurvy on his long voyages, attributed his success in part to persuading his reluctant crew to eat sauerkraut. When the first refused, Cook, knowing his men's dislike for anything out of the common way, although it be very much for their good, he ordered the cabbage to be served only to the officers, for when their superiors set a value on it, it becomes the finest stuff in the world. We now know that sauerkraut's effectiveness in preventing scurvy is down to the high levels of vitamin C in fresh cabbage, much of which is preserved through pickling. India has its own collection of pickles. Early accounts of kingly feasts highlight the integral role pickles have played in Indian cuisine for centuries. In a manuscript from the 11th century CE, we read of pickles prepared with the spicy fruits of Karira and the craneberry. King Someswara III, ruler of the western Chalukya kingdom in the 12th century, includes a preparation of acidic relishes of yam, curds, and fruit juices in his encyclopedic Manasolasa, a refresher of the mind. While the fictional king Nilapati, in the poet Nemichandra's erotic novel Lilavati, enjoys pickles of fruits, vegetables, and roots, flavored with camphor and presented on a lotus leaf. Ancient accounts describe relishes of mango, cucumber, and tamarind, preserved in vinegar or pickled in sour rice gruel. This custom has been maintained through the centuries. The 17th century writer Anaji described a meal with a pickle of tender mangoes, the stalks of which had not even lost their fresh green color, and vegetables delicately acid and salt. For those of you who are Patreon backers, I'll put some recipes for ancient pickles on Patreon for you to read. Of course, when we talk about vinegar, we cannot forget the most famous aged vinegar, which is balsamic vinegar. It accounts for 35% of all vinegar sold around the world. But most of the vinegar that is consumed, it's not true balsamic, unfortunately, guys, but instead the unaged Aceto Balsamico di Modena, which is a mixture of red wine vinegar, cooked grape must, and caramel. The traditional method of crafting balsamic vinegar takes place in both Modena and Reggio Emilia, the neighboring cities in northern Italy. It requires 5 to 9 wooden barrels made from different woods: mulberry, oak, juniper, cherry, ash, and acacia, to name a few, each built to different capacities. The barrels descend in size from 66 liters to 15 liters. At the outset, grape must that has been cooked down to caramelize and concentrate the sugars is fermented into sweet wine by a plethora of different yeasts. From there, it's acidified into vinegar, and then the largest barrels are filled with this vinegar, which is aged for a minimum of 1 year before being transferred to the next smallest barrel. Since wood is porous, water and some of the acetic acid are able to evaporate through the barrel, while larger aromatic compounds are not, leading to a milder, more concentrated flavor. The portion that disappears over time is known as the angel's share, a term which is also used in whiskey making. But the heavenly stuff is actually what is left behind. only enough vinegar to fill the next smallest barrel is transferred. What was removed from the large barrel is replaced with freshly acidified grape must. The vinegar continues to proceed down the line to successively smaller barrels, and each barrel is topped up with liquid from the next largest barrel. For a traditional balsamic, to be labelled DOP, Denomination of Origin of Production, the protected designation by the European Union, the vinegar must be aged for at least 12 years. At the end of the 12 years, a small portion of the finished balsamic vinegar is drawn from the smallest barrel and finds its way to discriminating customers. Balsamic vinegar production, as we see, is laborious, to say the least. As with almost every ancient civilization, China's early existence hinged on the domestication of nutrient-rich crops. So, Middle East we had chickpeas, in Mesoamerica we had maize, in East Asia there was the soybeans. There is no more efficient way to produce protein than to grow soy. It yields nearly 20 times more protein per hectare than grazing cattle or using the land for growing fodder. Of the 20 amino acids that our bodies require to function, there are 9 that we can't produce on our own. Soybeans are one of the few plant foods on Earth that contain all 9 of those essential amino acids. The earliest evidence points to the cultivation of small wild soybeans about 7,600 years ago in northern China. The selective breeding of soybeans for increased size began at least 5,000 years ago in China. Soy has proven absolutely essential to the region's foodways. But, nutritive value notwithstanding, it wasn't until soy met the fermentation that its true culinary potential was realized. Before miso, there was jiang. Jiangs, which translates roughly to pastes, encompass a large array of Chinese condiments and ferments. In fact, the oldest jiang was supposedly made from fish or meat and resembled a sort of thick hybrid between garum and miso. As practices of animal husbandry improved through the ages, things changed and the main protein source for jiangs shifted from animals to vegetables over generations. Fermented black soybeans may be one of the first fermented soy products to come out of China, with references dating as far back as 90 BCE. China's closest living relative to miso is huangjiang yellow paste, where soybeans are steamed and mixed with half their weight in wheat flour before being pressed into bricks and placed on reed mats to undergo wild fermentation in the open air. After a couple of weeks, wild molds that have grown on the surface of the bricks are brushed off and the bricks are mixed with a saline brine, further fermenting into viscous salty paste. When Chinese Buddhist monks arrived in Japan in the 6th century to enlighten the people of the island nation, they brought jiangs with them. The Japanese would absorb the idea of fermenting soybeans and run with it. Japanese miso makers brought greater control to the fermentation process by first growing mold on grains before introducing soybeans to the process. Miso making became a specialized industry. Over centuries, recipes were refined and fractured into local specialties. In Japan, there are dozens upon dozens of varieties of miso, made in myriad styles. There are a number of variables to play with the miso making process, each capable of having a profound effect on the outcome. Quick look how miso production looked through the history. In the early days, almost everything used to make miso was built from wood. The spades, the trays, large vats, and the buildings themselves were crafted from hardwood, usually Japanese cedar. Massive iron cauldrons would boil the water to steam rice and soybeans held in straw baskets. Cooled rice was spread on a large table and inoculated with a fine dusting of rice mold. Workers used spades to turn the rice, ensuring that the spores took hold evenly, then transferred it into cedar trays, which were stacked in a warm, humid room. Soybeans were cooked until tender and crushed beneath men's feet. Workers would then mix the prepared koji and salt with the beans. Then, ferry buckets of the mixture up a step ladder to be emptied to the huge cedar fermenting vats. Lids, weighted down with heavy rocks, would compact the mixture, removing the air, leading to more uniform fermentation. As the miso fermented, salty umami-rich juices would flow to the top and form a puddle. This liquid came to be known as tamari. It's usually less salty and more viscous than its descendant soyu. In Chinese, it's called jiangyu. You probably know it best as soy sauce. The vast wooden houses that used to store the miso lacked much of way of temperature control. Fermentation would slow down in the winter and pick up speed again in the summer. No two batches were ever identical. Each was a product of specific time and unique conditions under which it fermented. And this is it. This is a short history of pickles. I hope you got a taste for all the different fermentation and pickling techniques through the ages and through the continents. And that inspires you to make your own, of course, but also find and explore pickles from around the world, from China and Japan and modern Iraq and Turkey, and of course North Europe and Ukraine, which have a crazy variety of different pickles. And that's all for me. I've been Thomas Dinas. This was the Delicious Legacy podcast. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.